A Hell's Angel leader was born deaf, and lived every day in silence, rage, and violence. He couldn't hear the world, so he made it fear him instead. But one afternoon, on a burning Arizona street, an elderly black man stood in his way, calm, unshaken, and holding a Bible. And when that man reached out and touched his face, everything changed. For the first time in his life, the outlaw heard the sound of the world, engines, wind, and his own heartbeat. But with hearing came something worse, the voices of his past, the screams of the people he'd hurt, and the whisper of something he didn't understand. Forgiveness. Now the man who led a gang in silence must face a new kind of noise, the truth about who he is and what he's done. But when his old brothers come for revenge, and the only man who showed him mercy is caught in the crossfire, can a man who lived his whole life deaf to love ever truly hear the sound of redemption? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The Arizona sun was a hard, golden coin pressed against the desert sky. Heat shimmered off the blacktop, turning the long stretch of highway into a wavering mirage. A thunder of engines rolled across it, dozens of motorcycles, chrome flashing and leather vests glinting in the light. At the front rode Jake Razor Hensley, a man the world called King of the Hells Riders. He couldn't hear the roar of his own bike. He couldn't hear the wind whipping past him or the desert song of cicadas. The world had always been silent for Jake, and in that silence, he had built an empire of fear. He had learned to survive by reading faces, watching the way mouths moved and fists clenched. He could read anger, laughter, even lies. But sound. Sound was something other people lived in. For Jake, silence was safety. Silence meant control. The convoy pulled into a dusty roadside bar called the Rusted Spur. The men parked in a crooked row, their jackets patched with a flaming skull and the words, "Hell's Riders." Inside, the smell of beer and sweat hung heavy. The jukebox rattled out music Jake couldn't hear, but he felt the bass in his chest like a heartbeat. He watched his men laugh, shout, and slap backs. He smiled. His kind of smile. Tight. Cold. Spider, his second in command, tossed him a beer and mouthed, "We hit the east side tomorrow. Gotta remind them who owns this town." Jake nodded, his eyes dark with understanding. He didn't need words to agree. But that night, as he lay on his motel bed staring at the ceiling fan spin, something stirred in him. A restlessness he couldn't name. He had everything. Money, loyalty, fear. Yet there was an ache in the silence. Something missing. The next morning, the Hells Riders thundered into the small downtown of Winslow Crossing, a place too small to fight back but proud enough to glare. Their engines shook the poor windows. Jake led the charge, his sunglasses reflecting the main street lined with old shops and weathered faces. And that's when he saw him. In the middle of the road, standing straight as a fence post, was an old black man in worn clothes, holding a Bible in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. His eyes were calm, steady, and strangely fearless. The riders revved their engines, laughing, but the man didn't move. Jake slowed his bike. The gang parted around him, shouting. The old man's lips moved, forming words Jake couldn't hear. He looked confused for a moment, then stepped closer. The wind caught the pages of his Bible and turned them like wings. Jake dismounted, boots scraping gravel. The men jeered behind him, waiting for a show. Jake stood face to face with the old man, glaring. The man raised his hand slowly, trembling slightly with age, and reached for Jake's face. For the first time in years, Jake didn't move. He didn't pull away. The man's palm pressed against Jake's cheek, and the world exploded. A sound crashed into him. A roar of engines, laughter, shouting, the rush of wind, the bark of dogs, and the beating of his own heart. Jake staggered back, clutching his head, eyes wide in terror. He gasped, choking on noise he'd never known existed. "What's wrong with him?" one of the riders yelled. "He's freaking out!" Jake dropped to his knees, the pavement spinning beneath him. He could hear his breath. His breath. He slammed his hands over his ears, but it didn't stop. The world was alive and screaming. The old man knelt beside him, speaking softly. Jake could barely make out the words through the shock. "You can hear now? Don't waste it." Then everything faded. The noise, the faces, the light. He blacked out. When he woke, it was evening. His men were gone, and his bike leaned against a lamppost. His ears still rang, every sound sharp and painful. He could hear crickets in the grass and the hum of streetlights. He could hear his own heartbeat, steady and strong. He stumbled into the motel across the street, his boots echoing on the floorboards. He shut the door and stood in the dark, listening. Every creak, every whisper of air through the vent felt like a miracle and a curse. In the silence of his life, he'd been safe. Now the world wouldn't stop talking. He sat on the bed, pressing his palms against his ears until the skin burned. Tears stung his eyes. He didn't cry from pain. He cried because he didn't know what to do with the sound of his own soul. Through the thin motel wall, he heard laughter, a couple next door watching TV. Somewhere outside, a dog barked. He covered his head with a pillow and whispered the first words he had ever spoken aloud in his life, broken and rough from disuse. "Why me?" The sound of his voice, cracked, human, fragile, startled him. He had never heard himself before. Outside, the old preacher walked slowly into the night, his Bible tucked under his arm, his eyes lifted toward the stars. And far away, Jake sat trembling in a world that had suddenly found its voice. Morning light slid under the motel curtains and painted a bright line across the floor. Jake lay on his back, eyes open, listening. The air conditioner clicked. A car passed. Someone upstairs walked to the bathroom and turned on a faucet. Every tiny sound felt sharp, like clean glass. He raised a hand to his chest and felt his heart beat. He heard it too, slow, steady, alive. He sat up gently, careful not to make the bed springs squeal. He looked at his hands, scarred and strong, and flexed his fingers. His own breath sounded strange, like waves in a shell. He stood and crossed the room, each step a small drum. He opened the door and winced at the street noise. A truck downshifting, a woman calling to a dog, the far rattle of a shopping cart. The world used to be a picture. Now it was a picture with thunder. Jake walked to his bike and ran a hand along the handlebars. He hesitated before starting it. Yesterday the sound had hit him like a slap. Today he needed to try again. He pressed his lips together and turned the key. The engine coughed to life. The vibration felt familiar. The noise punched him in the chest. He let it idle and forced himself to breathe through the shock until the fear dulled a little. Then he killed the engine and stood still in the quiet street. He wasn't ready to ride. The old man. The hand on his face. The sudden flood. Jake closed his eyes and saw the preacher's calm gaze, like a deep pond that held the sky. He needed to find him. He needed to know what had happened and why his life had split in two. First, he headed to the Rusted Spur. The gang would be there at this hour, counting last night's cash and planning the next show of muscle. He pushed open the door and stepped into the dim bar. Music thumped from a jukebox in the corner. He felt it in the floor, and now also heard it in his bones. His men turned. Their faces shifted from surprise to interest. Spider rose from a table with a grin that never reached his eyes. "Boss," Spider said, shaping the word wide so Jake could read it easily. "You good?" Jake swallowed. He answered slowly, speaking out loud like a man trying on a suit that didn't quite fit. "I hear." The word came rough, but it came. Heads tilted. A few men laughed, uncertain. Spider moved closer. "You here?" His hands cut a mocking shape. "From that old man? Magic trick?" He snapped his fingers near Jake's ear just to see. The snap cracked like a tiny whip. Jake flinched, and anger flashed hot in his gut. The room leaned in. "Back off," Jake said. His voice shook, but the command was real. Spider raised his hands, smiling. The smile said, "We'll talk later." The eyes said, "You're falling." The men returned to their chairs, but the air felt thin. Jake scanned the bar. A TV above the counter played the morning news with captions, rolling under bright faces. He could hear the faint buzz of their voices now, a wash of sound that didn't match the text. He focused on the letters. Local preacher feeds the homeless by the river. A photo flashed. Dark skin, white hair, a steady gaze. Jake leaned closer. It was the man. He turned away from the bar without a word and walked into the daylight. Spider followed to the door and called after him, his mouth forming a careful, "Where you going?" Jake didn't answer. He climbed onto his bike, forced himself to accept the engine's blast, and rode toward the river, teeth clenched against the noise. The town fell behind. Cottonwoods lined the slow water, their leaves whispering. He cut the engine and listened to the rustle. A small church sat near the bank, white paint peeling, roof sagging. A hand-painted sign read, "River of Mercy Mission." Children laughed somewhere inside the building. Their voices were high and fierce like birds. Jake stood there, the sound filling him with something he could not name. He stepped into the shade of the open doorway. The smell of soup and coffee drifted out. To the left, a long folding table stood piled with bread, apples, and peanut butter jars. A big woman with a red bandana spoke to a line of folks with weary faces. Her name tag read, Mama D. She noticed Jake's vest and raised an eyebrow, then nodded like she'd seen worse than leather and a skull. Down the hall, in a bright room with cracked tile floors, the elderly black man from yesterday sat on a metal chair, holding a small bowl of cereal and speaking to a little girl with pink barrettes. He looked up. His eyes warmed. Jake's mouth went dry. He felt like a boy again, bare and braced for a blow he couldn't see. He took one step, then another. The preacher set down the bowl and stood. They faced each other. No engines, no jeers, just the drip of a leaking sink and a radio humming a soft hymn somewhere out of sight. "I found you," Jake said. The words were simple and true, and he heard them fall between them like pebbles into water. "I knew you would," the man answered. His voice was gentle and worn, like a road walked many times. "Sit with me, son." Jake lowered himself into a chair across from him. The metal legs scraped the floor. He winced at the scrape. The preacher noticed and gave a small smile that said, "It's a lot." "I know." "What did you do to me?" Jake asked. He tried to keep the fear out of his voice and failed. "I did nothing," the man said. "I prayed. God opened what was shut." He spread his fingers, palms up, as if showing empty hands. "My name is Elijah." Jake nodded once. He looked down at his fists and flexed them. "Why me?" Elijah's eyes softened. "Because you asked without asking?" He pointed, not at Jake's chest, but at the space between them. "Because God loves to surprise angry men." A beat of silence passed. In it, Jake heard the low drum of his own heart. He thought of all the times he'd stood over a man on a bar floor, rage pounding in his veins, the chill after, the emptiness. The noise in his head now felt different. Not rage, not yet peace either. Something like hunger. A small girl peeked around the door, the same one from earlier. Jake glanced at her. Pink barrettes clicked when she moved. "Hungry?" Mama D called from the hall. The girl nodded and skipped away. Elijah watched Jake watching the child. "You're hearing more than sound," he said. "You're hearing the life you never had a chance to touch." Jake swallowed. "I don't know what to do." "Start small," Elijah said. "Eat some soup. Help me fix a leaky roof. Listen when people speak. When you're ready, speak back." He shrugged, a little amused. "Maybe patch a hole without punching it wider." Jake almost smiled. Almost. "I run a crew," he said. "They won't like this." "They already don't," Elijah said, and his eyes showed that he knew more than he'd been told. "But a man who hears truth can stand in noise." Footsteps approached. Mama D leaned into the room, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked Jake up and down. "You hungry, leather boy?" she asked, voice brisk but kind. "We got chicken soup and bread, no charge, only rule, no trouble in this house." Jake nodded. "No trouble." The words tasted strange and good at the same time. He followed her to the table. The ladle rang gently against the pot, and he liked the sound. He took the bowl back to Elijah, who bowed his head to bless the food. Jake copied him, awkward, eyes open. They ate together in quiet. The soup was salty and warm. Children's laughter spilled through the hall like sunlight through blinds. The radio hummed that soft hymn again. Jake didn't know the words, but he felt the shape of them in his bones. When the bowls were empty, Elijah stood and took a toolbox from a shelf by the door. He jingled it on purpose, like a teacher ringing a bell. "Come," he said, "let's patch that roof before the afternoon heat." They climbed a narrow set of stairs to the attic. The wood smell was sweet and dry. A square of sky shone through a missing shingle. Elijah handed Jake a hammer. "Tap, don't smash," he said with a grin. "Different skill." Jake worked slowly, careful to control his hands. The hammer's rhythm became a steady song. Tap, 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 filling the space with something that felt clean. Sweat ran down his back. He didn't mind. He liked having a job that didn't end with someone bleeding. Halfway through, he paused and looked over the town from the open gap. The river glinted through the trees. A siren wailed far off, then faded. He heard a baby cry, a dog bark, and the wind in the cottonwoods. He could have stood there all day just listening. Elijah eased himself down onto a crate and rubbed his knees. "You were born into a quiet storm," he said. "No one taught you to love noise that wasn't rage. Now you can learn." Jake nodded once. The words slid into place like boards on a frame. "What if I can't?" he asked. "Then we try again tomorrow," Elijah said, "and the next day." They finished the patch as the sun tilted west. When they climbed down, Mama D had a plate of cornbread waiting. Jake ate standing up, crumbs on his vest, not caring. Elijah sat and watched him with a smile that made Jake feel both seen and safe. Outside the church, evening began to gather. Shadows stretched long and soft. Jake stepped to the doorway and looked at his bike. He thought of Spider's grin and the tight knot of the crew at the bar. He thought of the roof above him, snug now against the next storm. "I should go," he said. He didn't want to. Elijah joined him at the door. "You'll come back," he said, as if stating the weather. "The door will be open." Jake walked to the bike and swung a leg over the seat. He took a breath, started the engine, and let the sound wash over him without flinching. He turned once more to the church. Elijah raised a hand in a small, steady wave. Mama D called, "Don't be stupid," in a voice that somehow held both care and command. Jake almost laughed. He rode back toward town in the soft blue of early night. The air was cooler. Streetlights blinked on one by one, each a tiny star. When he reached the motel, he parked and sat for a minute, helmet in his lap, listening to crickets and faraway traffic. He looked at his hands again, grease in the lines, a smear of roof tar on his wrist. He smiled, a real one this time, small and surprised. Inside, he washed up and sat on the edge of the bed. The room hummed. The vent, the fridge, the world beyond the thin wall. He didn't hate the sound anymore. He lay back and stared at the slow fan, its blades whispering. Before he turned off the lamp, he reached for the small Gideon Bible in the drawer. He didn't open it. He just held it, feeling the weight, the thin paper edges, the quiet promise he couldn't name. "Tomorrow?" he said out loud to the empty room, his voice a little stronger than the morning. "I'll go back tomorrow." He clicked off the light. The dark settled around him like a soft coat. The night sang, and this time, he let it. The next morning, Jake woke to sunlight spilling through the cheap curtains. The world outside was already busy. Cars rumbled, birds shouted. Someone was arguing in the parking lot. Every sound tugged at him. It was strange and new, and though part of him wanted to slam the window shut, another part wanted to listen. He sat on the edge of the bed and rubbed his temples. It wasn't a dream. He could still hear the low hum of the air conditioner, the ticking of his watch. He stared at his hands, big and rough, remembering the preacher's warm palm on his face. "You can hear now. Don't waste it." The memory sent a shiver through him. Jake showered, dressed, and stepped outside. The air was cool, crisp, and full of life. He climbed on his bike and rode slowly through the quiet part of town, trying to take it all in. He could hear the wind now. It whistled around his helmet and fluttered his jacket. It felt almost like a song, one he'd never known existed. But the beauty came with confusion. The noise wouldn't stop. He could hear every car engine, every barking dog, every shout in the distance. He rode through it like a man drowning in water he didn't yet know how to swim in. When he passed the old church by the river again, his chest tightened. Yesterday it had been an accident, a meeting he didn't plan. Today, he came back because he needed to. The front door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, the same warmth met him. Voices, clinking dishes, the faint smell of coffee and soap. Mama D stood behind a folding table, handing out sandwiches to a line of men and women in worn coats. She spotted him right away. "Well, look who's back," she said, grinning. "Thought maybe you'd gotten scared of soup." Jake smiled awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. "I'm not good with people," he admitted, his voice rough but steady. "Baby, nobody here is," Mama D replied, laughing. "That's why we all come." She pointed toward the back. "He's in the classroom. Go on." Jake walked down the hallway. The radio played a soft hymn, something about mercy and home. He paused outside the door, listening. He could hear Elijah's voice now, soft, low, full of calm authority. The preacher was reading aloud to a group of kids sitting cross-legged on the floor. Jake leaned in the doorway and watched. The children looked at Elijah as if he were made of gold. His words rolled gently, like waves on a quiet shore. When Elijah noticed Jake, he smiled without surprise. "You came back," he said simply. Jake nodded. "I couldn't stay away." Elijah stood, dusted his hands, and waved the kids toward Mamadi for lunch. He motioned for Jake to sit. The two of them faced each other again, sunlight falling through a cracked window between them. "What do you hear today?" Elijah asked. "Everything," Jake said. "And it's too much." He rubbed his temples. "Engines, people, the world. It's all yelling at once." Elijah chuckled softly. "The world's always been loud. You're just catching up." Jake tried to laugh, but the sound came out half-broken. "I don't know how to live in it." "Then learn," Elijah said. "Start by listening, not just to the noise, to what it means." They sat in silence a moment, and Jake found he could hear the faint hum of the light above them, the soft whisper of Elijah's breathing. It wasn't just sound. It was life. Elijah reached into his coat and pulled out an old pocket watch. The gold plating was worn, the glass scratched. "This was my father's," he said, turning it over in his palm. "Stopped ticking 30 years ago. I kept it. Anyway. Reminds me that even what's broken can keep time if you listen right." Jake nodded slowly, not sure what to say. Elijah leaned forward. "What do you want to do with what you've been given?" Jake looked down at his hands. "I don't know. All I've ever done is fight. Lead my crew, take what I want." He shook his head. "But now, every time I think about it, I hear something else. It's like a voice in the back of my mind." "What does it say?" Elijah asked. Jake hesitated. "It says, 'Stop.'" The preacher's eyes softened. "Then maybe that's the start of hearing God." The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He wasn't sure he believed in God, but he believed in Elijah, because somehow the old man's words felt real in a way nothing else did. They spent the rest of the afternoon fixing a broken window and tightening loose hinges around the mission. Every clang and creak became part of Jake's learning. He didn't realize how peaceful the work was until the sun began to dip low. When the job was done, Elijah wiped his hands and said, "You've got good strength, but strength's just noise until you use it for something that matters." Jake smiled faintly. "You talk like a book." Elijah laughed. "Good. Then maybe one day you'll read one." That night, Jake returned to his motel room. He made coffee for the first time just to hear it drip. The simple rhythm filled the silence like a heartbeat. But when he sat down with the cup, the quiet turned strange again. Haunted. He could hear whispers. Not real voices in the room, but echoes in his memory. Men yelling during fights, the cries of someone he'd hurt years ago. The sounds grew sharper until he pressed his palms over his ears, rocking slightly on the bed. "Stop," he muttered. "Please." The voices faded, but they left something heavy behind. Jake looked toward the nightstand. The small Gideon Bible he'd taken out yesterday still lay there. He opened it now, just to see. His eyes landed on a verse. "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." He stared at it a long time, the words burning into him. He didn't know if it was a joke or a message. Maybe both. Outside, thunder rumbled far away. The first drops of rain tapped the window. He could hear each one. Soft, real, beautiful. He lay back and closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time, the world's noise didn't feel like punishment. It felt like possibility. And somewhere in the rhythm of the rain, he thought he could hear Elijah's calm voice whisper, "Keep listening, son." Jake smiled into the dark. "Yeah," he said softly. "I'm listening." The following morning broke clear and bright, the kind of desert day when every color looked sharper. Jake rolled out of bed, made coffee, and stood by the window while it brewed. He could hear the steady drip, the faint hum of the machine, even the quiet whistle of wind under the door. 3 days ago, he'd lived in silence. Now the world buzzed around him like a live wire. He ate a quick breakfast and rode to the old mission. The air was still cool when he parked outside, but already the sun was climbing. Elijah and Mama D were setting up folding tables under a tree, laying out bread and jars of peanut butter. A few men and women were already lined up, waiting. "Morning, Jake," Mama D called, her tone friendly but brisk. "You look less grumpy today. Miracle number 2. Jake gave a small grin. "You talk a lot for sunrise." She laughed, wagging a spoon at him. "And you still don't talk enough. Balance, honey." Elijah came out carrying a box of canned soup. He nodded in greeting. "Good to see you, son. Grab a crate, will you?" Jake did as asked, setting the box down beside the others. They worked in rhythm, the sound of jars clinking, laughter spilling, and wind moving through leaves. It felt right. Ordinary. When the line was done and everyone had been fed, Elijah motioned toward the riverbank. "Walk with me." They strolled under the cottonwoods, the sun flickering through branches. Jake listened to the crunch of gravel beneath their boots. "You learning anything new about sound?" Elijah asked. Jake nodded. "It's not just noise anymore. It's connection. I can hear people laugh. I didn't know laughter could make a man feel lighter." He paused, then added quietly, "But I hear other things too. Stuff I don't want to." Elijah waited. "Voices from before," Jake said. "Fights, screams. I thought I forgot them, but they're still there. Guess I hear my own sins now." Elijah nodded slowly. Hearing truth is never easy, but it's how healing starts. They walked in silence for a while. Jake tried to imagine what healing looked like for a man like him. He wasn't sure he deserved it. By the time he returned to town, the sky had shifted toward afternoon gold. He decided to check on the gang. They hadn't seen him in days, and Spider didn't take absence kindly. The bar was dim, loud, and thick with cigarette smoke. Jake felt the noise hit him the moment he stepped inside. Laughter, shouting, a jukebox blaring an old country song. For years, he'd lived for this chaos. Now it made him feel sick. Spider sat at the corner table, boots up, beer in hand. His grin widened when he saw Jake. "Well, look who finally crawled back." Jake sat opposite him. "Been busy." "Busy doing what? Bible study?" Spider snorted. "We heard about that preacher. Town says you're his new pet project." Jake's jaw tightened. "He helped me." Spider leaned in. "Helped you what? Go soft? You forget who you are?" His voice rose, and a few men turned to watch. "I didn't forget," Jake said quietly. "I just don't want to live deaf anymore." Spider slammed his beer down, foam spilling. "You ain't deaf now, but maybe you should be. You were better when you couldn't hear how weak you sound." Jake stood slowly. "Watch yourself." Spider rose too, eyes flashing. "What are you going to do? Pray me into submission?" For a long second, the bar froze. Jake could hear every sound, the hum of the ceiling fan, the glass rattling on the table, his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The old version of himself would have thrown the first punch. But now, he did something that shocked them all. He walked away. Spider laughed bitterly behind him. "You ain't my leader anymore, Razor. Not if you're working for that preacher." Jake stopped in the doorway. He turned, looked back, and said calmly, "Maybe that's the first right thing you ever said." Then he left. Outside, the sunlight felt cleaner, the air freer, but his stomach twisted. He knew Spider. That look in his eyes meant trouble was brewing. He rode back toward the mission, the engine's growl steady beneath him. The familiar white church came into view, small and cracked but glowing in the evening light. He parked and walked toward it, still hearing Spider's words echo in his head. Inside, the sound of music drifted through the hall. A few volunteers and children stood in a loose circle, singing a gospel hymn. The voices rose and fell like waves. Jake froze at the doorway. He didn't know the tune, but the sound made something deep inside him ache. Elijah was at the front, clapping softly, eyes closed. Mamadi sang harmony, her voice rich and warm. When the song ended, laughter rippled through the room. Elijah turned and spotted Jake. "Come on in, son," he said with that easy smile. "There's room for one more." Jake stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked under his boots. For a while, he just stood there, unsure. Then, almost without meaning to, he joined in the next song, mouthing words he barely knew. His voice cracked, but no one laughed. They sang around him, covering his mistakes with grace. When the music faded, Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You hear that?" he asked. Jake nodded, eyes glistening. "It's the best thing I ever heard." Elijah chuckled. "That's the sound of heaven trying to break through." Later that night, as the volunteers packed up, Jake lingered by the doorway. He looked back at the mission, at the flicker of lights, the soft hum of laughter, the old preacher locking up for the night. For the first time in his life, he felt the quiet peace that came after noise, not before it. But outside, in the shadows across the street, a figure watched. Spider. Cigarette glowing in the dark. His grin was gone now, replaced by cold anger. Jake didn't see him. He only heard the crickets and thought the world sounded almost kind. He had no idea a storm was already gathering, one that would soon test everything he'd just begun to believe. The next morning began soft and golden. A thin mist hung over the river, and birds filled the air with chatter. Jake arrived at the mission early, still unsure if he belonged there but unable to stay away. He parked his motorcycle quietly and leaned it against the old white fence. For a moment, he just listened. The world no longer scared him. It fascinated him. Every sound, from the hum of bees to the rustle of leaves, felt like a message he was learning to read. Inside, Elijah and Mama D were already busy. The old preacher was stacking cans while humming an old hymn. Mama D stirred a giant pot of soup and scolded a volunteer who was cutting bread too thick. "You trying to feed an army, baby? Thin slices. Let it stretch," she said, shaking her head. When Jake stepped in, both looked up. "Morning, son," Elijah greeted with a smile. "You're early." "Didn't sleep much," Jake said. "Thought I'd be useful." "Useful is good," Mama D said, handing him a ladle. "Start with this, then we'll see if you can handle a hammer later." Jake grinned, rolling up his sleeves. He joined the small kitchen crew, scooping steaming soup into paper bowls. The air was filled with the scent of carrots, onions, and something smoky. Children laughed nearby, waiting with cups of juice. As he worked, Jake felt something new, a rhythm. The clatter of spoons, Elijah's soft singing, the scrape of chairs, all of it formed a melody that made him feel alive. The noise no longer hurt his ears. It soothed his heart. By noon, the line stretched outside. The day was warm, the sunlight sharp. Jake wiped sweat from his brow and handed out another bowl to a man missing a shoe. "Eat slow," he said gently. The man nodded and smiled, his teeth missing but his eyes grateful. Mama D noticed. "See? You're a natural," she teased. "I've never done anything like this," Jake admitted. "Feels different." "Different's not bad," she said. "Sometimes different is what saves you." Later, when the rush slowed, Elijah motioned for Jake to follow him to the back porch. They sat side by side, watching the river glimmer in the light. "You're picking this up quick," Elijah said. "Got a good heart for service." Jake shook his head. I've done too much bad to have a good heart." Elijah smiled kindly. "You're here now, aren't you? That's the start." He leaned on his cane. "You ever think maybe you were meant for more than the road?" Jake sighed. "The road's all I know. It's where I found power, respect." Elijah turned to him. "And peace? You find that too?" Jake didn't answer. He didn't have to. The preacher nodded, as if that silence was enough. They sat there for a while, the breeze cool on their faces. Jake listened to the sound of water licking the rocks and the rustle of the trees. It was the quietest peace he'd ever known. But the peace didn't last. When Jake rode back into town later that day to check on his gang, the air felt heavy. The bar was dim as always, the same stale smell of smoke and beer. Spider was at their usual table, surrounded by a few of the younger riders. They stopped talking when Jake walked in. Spider's smile was tight. "Well, well, look who's back from Sunday school." Jake ignored him, heading to the counter for a drink. "Just checking in." Spider stood, his boots clicking against the floor. "Checking in? You mean checking out? We hear you've been playing preacher." Jake turned slowly. "You don't know what you're talking about." Spider grinned. "Don't I? Folks say you've been working for that old man, feeding bums, fixing roofs." He spat on the floor. "You're making us look weak, Razor." Jake's hands curled into fists. He forced himself to breathe. "You don't understand. That man, he's different. Helped me when no one else did." Spider laughed harshly. "He's making a fool out of you." Jake stepped forward, close enough to smell the beer on Spider's breath. "Watch your mouth." Spider didn't flinch. "You used to lead men, Razor. Now you follow a preacher. Guess miracles do make men stupid." The room went quiet. The jukebox hummed in the corner. Jake felt every eye on him. He wanted to fight. Every instinct told him to end it right there, to shut Spider up the only way he knew how. But then Elijah's voice echoed in his mind. "Tap, don't smash." Jake backed up and walked out. Behind him, Spider's laughter followed like a slap. "You're not one of us anymore," he yelled. Jake stopped outside, breathing hard. The sun had dropped low, painting the street orange. He looked down the road toward the mission. For the first time, he didn't care about what the gang thought. That evening, he returned to the church. The children were gone, the lights dim. Elijah sat by the front steps, tuning an old guitar. The strings sang softly. "Rough day?" Elijah asked without looking up. Jake sat beside him. "Yeah, I think I just lost my crew." Elijah plucked a single note that hung in the air. "Sometimes you gotta lose what's killing you to find what can save you." Jake leaned back against the wall, eyes on the sky. The first stars blinked to life. He'd never noticed how loud night could be. Crickets, wind, the faint murmur of the town in the distance. It wasn't empty at all. It was full of life. After a while, Elijah handed him the guitar. "Here, strum it." Jake hesitated, then brushed the strings. The sound was uneven, clumsy. But when Elijah nodded encouragement, Jake tried again. This time it came smoother. He grinned. "Doesn't sound too bad." Elijah smiled. "It sounds like a man learning to listen." They played quietly until darkness settled fully. For Jake, it felt like the first true calm he'd ever known. A night where sound didn't threaten him, but healed him instead. And though he didn't realize it yet, the world around him was shifting. Spider's pride had curdled into rage. The next fire was coming. By late summer, the heat rolled, heavy across the town, thick enough to taste. The mission had become Jake's second home. He spent his mornings helping Elijah fix the old building, patching walls, replacing hinges, and hauling supplies. In the afternoons, he helped serve meals and played games with the children who came for food and laughter. He didn't realize how much he'd changed until one of the little boys asked him, "Mr. Jake, were you always this nice?" And the question made him laugh and ache at the same time. Elijah often said little, but his presence steadied Jake. The old man carried peace like a shadow. Even when his knees hurt or his hands shook, Elijah never complained. He hummed hymns, slow and soft, while he worked, and Jake started humming along without noticing. One afternoon, as they fixed a broken fence behind the mission, Elijah handed Jake a hammer and nodded toward a crooked board. "You hit straighter these days," he said. "Guess your hands are catching up to your heart." Jake chuckled. "You always got a way of turning simple stuff into wisdom." "Maybe," Elijah said, smiling. "Or maybe wisdom's just seeing what's already true." When the day wound down, Mama D called them inside. The smell of cornbread and stew filled the hall. Jake sat with the volunteers, eating and laughing quietly. He'd never known such comfort could come from something as simple as sitting down with others. As the sun sank behind the cottonwoods, Elijah stood and led a short prayer for the night. His voice was calm and sure. "Lord, thank you for food, for work, for the sound of laughter," he said, "and for the souls you're still reaching." Jake bowed his head. For the first time, the words didn't sound far away. After dinner, he rode back to his motel, tired but at peace. The world that once felt like chaos now hummed with quiet purpose. He showered, sat on the bed, and wrote in a notebook Elijah had given him. His handwriting was messy, but the words came slowly, honestly. "I'm hearing things I never heard before. Not just noise, meaning. Maybe this is what life's supposed to sound like." He fell asleep with the notebook open on his chest. Hours later, a siren screamed in the distance. Then another. Jake's eyes shot open. The night air glowed faintly orange through the curtains. He stumbled to the window. Smoke rose above the trees, the direction of the mission. His heart slammed against his ribs. He grabbed his jacket, rushed outside, and kicked his motorcycle to life. The roar of the engine filled his ears, but this time he didn't care. He sped through the empty streets, the wind slicing against his face, his mind spinning. When he turned the corner onto River Road, he saw the flames. The mission was on fire. The roof crackled, spitting embers into the night sky. People were shouting, running with buckets, some crying. Jake slammed his bike to a stop, threw off his helmet, and ran straight for the front door. "Elijah!" he yelled, though the sound nearly drowned in the roar of the fire. Mama D was coughing near the steps, her face smeared with soot. "Kids! Inside! Can't get 'em all out!" she gasped. Jake didn't hesitate. He yanked his shirt over his mouth and plunged into the smoke. Inside, the heat was unbearable. The air was thick, choking. Flames crawled up the wooden beams, hissing. "Anybody in here?" he shouted. He thought he heard a cry to the left and stumbled toward it. A young woman crouched near the kitchen door, clutching 2 coughing children. Jake scooped one into his arms and shouted for her to follow. They stumbled out through the front just as part of the roof gave way behind them. Once outside, Jake handed the child to Mama D and turned back toward the building. "Where's Elijah?" Mama D shook her head, eyes wide. "He was helping folks out the back." Jake didn't wait. He ran around the side, the ground hot beneath his boots. Near the back steps, he found Elijah lying on the ground, one arm shielding his face. Smoke poured from a shattered window above him. "Got you, old man," Jake said, dropping to his knees. He pulled Elijah to his feet, coughing and wheezing. Together they stumbled away from the building just as another wall collapsed in a burst of sparks. Firefighters arrived minutes later, spraying hoses into the blaze. The mission crackled, moaned, and began to fall in on itself. Jake stood there, holding Elijah upright. The preacher's shirt was singed, and his eyes streamed from the smoke. But he was alive. "You're crazy," Jake said hoarsely, his voice rough from the smoke. Elijah coughed, then smiled faintly. "Takes one to save one." The sound of sirens faded to a steady hum. Jake turned and saw Spider leaning against his truck at the edge of the crowd, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. Their eyes met. Spider smirked and flicked the cigarette into the dirt before driving away. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew. The next morning, the town stood silent before the blackened shell of the mission. Only the front cross remained standing, charred but unbroken. Jake's throat tightened as he stared at it. He felt anger boiling in him, the old, dangerous kind. Spider had done this. Jake could feel it in his bones. He turned to Elijah, who sat on the curb with a blanket around his shoulders. "I'll find him," Jake said, his voice low. "He's not getting away with this." Elijah looked up, his face weary but calm. "No, son?" Jake's jaw clenched. "He burned your home down. He could have killed you." "And if you kill him," Elijah said softly, "then what did you save?" Jake stared at him. For a moment, he didn't understand. "You want me to just let it go?" "I want you to listen," Elijah said. "Anger has its own sound. You've lived by it your whole life. Don't go deaf again." Jake's hands shook. He turned away, staring at the ruins. The smell of ash clung to everything. "I can't promise that," he whispered. Elijah placed a trembling hand on his arm. "You don't have to promise. Just don't stop hearing what's right." Jake nodded slowly, though his heart still burned. He walked away from the wreckage, each step heavy, the sound of crunching glass beneath his boots echoing like judgment. That night, he sat alone on the hood of his motorcycle outside his motel. The stars were sharp above him, cold and endless. The anger pulsed in his veins, but beneath it was something deeper. Fear. Not fear of Spider, but fear of himself. He whispered into the dark, "Don't lose your hearing twice," repeating Elijah's words until they became a prayer. The morning after the fire, the town smelled of smoke. A gray haze hung low, and the ground near the mission was still warm to the touch. The once white walls were now black skeletons, brittle and broken. Jake stood in the rubble, his boots crunching on burned glass and ashes. He could still hear the faint crackle of cooling wood, a sound that made his chest ache. He had spent the night turning Spider's name over and over in his head. Spider was the only man cruel enough to burn down a church just to make a point. Jake could still see that smug grin from the fire line, the flicker of the cigarette, the look that said, "This was me." Mama Dee's voice broke through his thoughts. "You can't stay out here all day, baby," she said softly. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes red from crying. "Ain't nothing left to save." Jake turned to her. "There's something left," he said, his voice low and rough. "A debt." Mama Dee shook her head slowly. "Don't do this. Elijah wouldn't want you going back to that life." He didn't answer. Instead, he looked towards the road, his jaw tight. Elijah was in the hospital that morning, bandaged but breathing. Jake visited him briefly before leaving. The preacher's room smelled like antiseptic and old linen. Machines beeped softly in rhythm with his heartbeat. Elijah's eyes opened when Jake entered. "You're walking heavy," the old man murmured. "That means trouble." Jake tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You should rest. I'll handle things." Elijah studied him quietly, reading more than words. "Handle them how, son?" Jake looked away. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. That sounds like revenge, Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. Jake clenched his fists. He tried to kill you. He burned your church. Elijah coughed, each word coming slow but steady. If you fight darkness with darkness, you just make more night. Jake's throat tightened. I can't just sit here. The old man closed his eyes. Then walk, but don't lose your hearing twice. Those words followed Jake out of the room and all the way to the desert. By late afternoon, he found Spider. The old junkyard sat on the edge of town, surrounded by piles of rusted metal and forgotten cars. Jake's motorcycle rumbled over the gravel as he pulled up. Spider's truck was there, along with 2 bikes he recognized, his old crew. He dismounted, every muscle in his body wound tight. Spider stepped out from behind a heap of metal, arms crossed. Knew you'd come, he said with a grin. Why'd you do it? Jake asked. His voice was calm, but his hands were trembling. Spider shrugged. Message needed sending. You were losing the gang, Razor. Someone had to remind folks who we are. You could have killed them, Jake shouted, stepping forward. There were kids in that building, Spider. Spider smirked. And you? You're one of them now, huh? Feeding soup and singing hymns? You're not the man you used to be. Jake took another step. No, I'm not. He swung. The punch landed hard, knocking Spider back into a pile of scrap. The other men scrambled, shouting, but they didn't interfere. They knew better. Spider wiped blood from his lip, still smiling. There he is, the real Razor. Jake lunged again, fists flying, years of anger spilling out at once. Spider fought back, fast and vicious. They crashed into the dirt, rolling, metal clanging around them. The sound of their grunts and hits filled the yard, raw, ugly, and human. At last, Jake pinned him down, his forearm pressed against Spider's throat. Spider's breath came in gasps. Do it! Spider rasped, laughing even as he choked. Prove you're still the devil I know. Jake's vision blurred with rage. Every part of him wanted to end it, to silence that laughter, to make the pain stop. But then, through the noise and pounding in his chest, he heard Elijah's voice again. Don't lose your hearing twice. Jake froze. His hands trembled. The fury drained out of him, leaving only exhaustion. He released his grip and stumbled back, breathing hard. Spider coughed and sat up, glaring. You don't have it in you anymore? He spat. Jake stood, his body shaking. You're right, he said quietly. And thank God for that. He turned and walked toward his bike. Spider's laughter followed him, bitter and hollow. You'll regret this. Jake didn't look back. When he returned to the mission's remains that evening, the sky had turned orange and purple. The air was still thick with the smell of smoke. He found Elijah there, standing weakly with a cane, wrapped in a light jacket. You shouldn't be up, Jake said, hurrying to him. Elijah smiled faintly. Doctors can't keep me away from my own home. He looked at the blackened church and sighed. The Lord gives, the Lord takes, but he never leaves. Jake swallowed hard. I wanted to make Spider pay. Elijah nodded slowly. And? I didn't. Good, Elijah said softly. That's your first real miracle. Jake stared at him. It doesn't feel like one. Miracles never do when... They're still healing, Elijah said, patting his arm. You stopped the fire from spreading. That's what matters. The two stood there in silence as the sun sank behind the horizon. Crickets began to sing, their chirping soft and steady. Jake listened to the sound, the rhythm of life continuing even after ruin. I don't know what comes next, Jake admitted. Rebuilding, Elijah said. Not just walls, hearts. That night, Jake stayed by the ruins, tending a small lantern. He couldn't sleep. He sat in the dirt, staring at the stars, hearing every small sound of the world around him, the crackle of the dying fire, the whisper of wind through the ashes. He finally whispered, "I didn't kill him." The night replied with crickets and peace. And for the first time in years, Jake felt a strange sense of freedom in his chest. Days passed, and life in the little Arizona town moved forward, slower than before but steadier. The ashes of the mission were still warm when Jake and the townsfolk began clearing debris. Men from the diner, women from the church, even some of Jake's old riders showed up one by one, uneasy but willing to help. For once, no one cared about who belonged to what side of town. They just worked together, shoveling, lifting, and hammering. Jake took charge quietly, moving heavy beams and hauling scrap metal. The sound of tools replaced the sound of engines. Sweat rolled down his back, but he didn't mind. It felt good. Honest. By the third week, a skeleton of a new roof stood over the foundation. It wasn't much yet, but it was something to believe in. The mission's name, River of Mercy, was painted again on a plank above the door. Jake had carved it himself with a steady hand. Elijah was there every day, even when he shouldn't have been. His limp had worsened after the fire, and his breathing came slower now, but he refused to rest. "A shepherd watches till the fence is strong," he said when Jake tried to send him home. "You just keep hammering." Mamadi fussed over him constantly, swatting his hand away from heavy work. "You're 78, not 28, she'd remind him. "Sit down before I nail you to that bench myself." Elijah would just laugh softly and wink at Jake. "Don't worry, the Lord will take me when He's ready, not when I'm tired." One afternoon, as the sun burned high, they took a break under a tarp for shade. Maria, a young nurse who volunteered from the clinic, brought sandwiches and water for everyone. She was quick with a smile and fearless in speech. "You should drink more," she told Jake, handing him a bottle. "You look like you're trying to melt." Jake chuckled. "Feels like I might." She sat beside him, brushing dust from her scrubs. "You don't talk much, do you?" He shrugged. "Never had much reason to before. Now I'm still learning what to say." Maria tilted her head. "You don't have to talk fancy. People mostly just need someone who listens." Jake looked at her, realizing she sounded a lot like Elijah. "Guess I'm getting a lot of practice," he said. That evening, as the workday ended, Elijah gathered everyone in front of the half-built chapel. The sunset behind him made his white hair glow. "We lost a building," he said, voice rough but clear, "but not a mission. This place was never just wood and walls. It's the people who fill it, the laughter, the kindness, the hands that build it again." Applause rippled through the crowd. Jake stood back, watching Elijah speak, pride swelling in his chest. But under it was worry. The old man's voice cracked halfway through his speech, and he coughed long and hard before finishing. That night, Jake helped him back to his small rented house a few streets away. The place was simple. A small cross above the bed, photos of strangers on the walls, people Elijah had helped through the years. "You need rest," Jake said. "Let me handle tomorrow's shift." Elijah smiled weakly. "You'd miss my nagging." Jake sat beside the bed, his voice quiet. "Don't scare me like that again." The old preacher chuckled. "You sound like Mama D now." Then he reached for Jake's hand. "You've done good, son. Whatever happens next, remember, you heard grace. Don't unhear it." Jake swallowed hard. "Don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere." Elijah closed his eyes and whispered, "Not yet." Outside, the night hummed softly. Jake stayed until the preacher drifted to sleep, then slipped out quietly. The next day began bright and hot. Work continued as usual, laughter echoing across the lot. Then, around noon, Spider showed up. He rode in slow, his engine growling like a threat. The chatter stopped. Maria froze mid-step, clutching her clipboard. Jake stepped forward. "You shouldn't be here." Spider dismounted, sneering. "I heard you're rebuilding. Thought I'd see what holiness looks like up close." "Turn around and leave," Jake said. His voice was calm but firm. Spider smirked. "Still preaching now? Thought you were done pretending." Before Jake could answer, Elijah came outside, leaning heavily on his cane. "No pretending here, son," he said. "Just forgiveness." Spider's eyes narrowed. "Forgiveness? After what I did?" Elijah nodded. "Even for you." Spider's face twisted with rage. "You're a fool, old man." He drew a pistol from his belt. Gasps erupted around the lot. Maria screamed. Jake moved without thinking, stepping between Spider and Elijah. "Don't do this," he said, voice steady. Spider's hand shook. "You took my family, Razor. My crew. My name. You think building this shack makes you better?" "This isn't about being better," Jake said. "It's about being new." "Same thing," Spider hissed. His finger twitched on the trigger. Then a sound split the air. Bang. Elijah stumbled backward, clutching his side. The pistol clattered to the ground. Maria rushed forward, catching the old man as he fell. "No!" Jake roared, lunging at Spider. He tackled him to the dirt, wrestled the gun away, and pinned him down. Spider swung wildly, but Jake barely felt it. Rage poured through him like fire. He raised his fist and stopped. Elijah's words echoed, "Don't lose your hearing twice." Jake's arm trembled. Then he dropped the gun beside Spider, breathing hard. "Get out of here," he said, "before I forget who I am." Spider spat, blood on his lip, but he ran. Jake turned and ran to Elijah's side. The preacher's shirt was dark with blood. Maria was pressing her hands to the wound, her face pale. "He needs a hospital," she said. Jake helped lift him, carrying him to his bike. "Hold on, old man, don't you dare let go." Elijah's voice was faint, barely more than a whisper. "Don't be afraid. I'm just going home." Jake's throat tightened. "You're not going anywhere." But Elijah only smiled weakly. "You hear him clearly now, don't you?" Tears blurred Jake's vision. "Don't talk like that." "Then keep listening," Elijah breathed. His hand slipped from Jake's arm. By the time they reached the hospital, it was too late. Jake sat outside the emergency room doors, long after the doctors stopped trying. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in orange fire. He could hear everything. The faint hum of the air conditioner, the squeak of nurses' shoes, a baby crying somewhere down the hall. He'd never known silence could be so loud. The funeral took place 3 days later beneath a wide Arizona sky. The whole town came. Bikers, preachers, waitresses, and strangers Elijah had once helped. The choir sang softly, their voices trembling through the dry air. Jake stood beside the casket, wearing a plain black shirt instead of his leather vest. His eyes were red, but no tears came. When they lowered Elijah into the earth, Jake knelt and pressed his calloused hand to the wooden lid. "You gave me sound," he whispered. "Now I'll use it right." That evening, he returned to the burned mission, now cleared and ready to rebuild. The air was still, the silence almost kind. He took off his old Hell's Riders patch, looked at it for a long moment, then laid it gently at the foot of the cross that still stood. "I'm done with that noise," he said softly. The wind stirred, carrying the faint echo of Elijah's voice. "Keep listening." Jake smiled through his grief. For the first time since the fire, he felt peace settle in his chest. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full of promise. He looked at the horizon, whispered, "Thank you," and walked toward the rising dawn. Months passed, and the new mission rose from the ashes, stronger than before. Fresh white paint gleamed under the sun, and a new sign hung above the door. The Open Ear. The name had been Jake's idea. He said it was what Elijah taught him, to listen not just with ears, but with the heart. Inside, the hall was filled with laughter, the clatter of dishes and the hum of hope. Jake ran the place now, with Mama D at his side, and Maria helping after her hospital shifts. Veterans repaired engines in the yard, kids painted murals on the walls, and the hungry lined up for meals. Everyone had a job, and everyone mattered. One afternoon, a young biker came hesitantly through the door, tattoos still fresh and eyes full of fear. Jake recognized the look. Lost, angry, searching. He handed the man a bowl of soup and said, "Eat first, talk later." The biker nodded, surprised by the kindness. Later, Maria found Jake fixing a broken bench. "You've changed this place," she said. "You've changed a lot of lives." Jake smiled. "Elijah did that. I'm just keeping the sound going." As dusk settled, he locked the doors and stood outside, watching the mission glow in the warm evening light. Music drifted from inside, a hymn the children had learned by heart. Jake closed his eyes, listening. In that quiet moment, he heard Elijah's voice again, soft and certain. "Good work, son." Jake smiled, whispering, "Still listening, old man." The night breeze carried laughter, music, and peace, the sound of a life rebuilt. A year later, the desert wind carried a gentler tune. The Open Ear mission had become a home for the forgotten, veterans, wanderers, and men who once lived by fists instead of faith. Jake stood on the porch, watching a crowd of bikers line up for the charity ride he'd organized. Engines rumbled, not in anger, but in purpose. He walked to the front, microphone trembling slightly in his hand. "I was born deaf," he said, his voice deep but steady. "Not just in my ears, but in my heart. A good man taught me to listen, to people, to truth, and to God." The crowd went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. Jake looked out at the faces, some rough, some tearful. "You don't need a miracle to change," he said. "You just need to hear what's already calling." Applause erupted. The engines roared to life, echoing like thunder across the desert. Jake smiled, feeling Elijah's presence in the sound. That night he walked through the quiet hall of the mission, the hymn of the day still echoing in his mind. He whispered, still listening, and for the first time, truly meant it. A year after the fire, the Open Ear stood tall and shining beneath the Arizona sun. The mission was alive again, filled with music, laughter, and second chances. Jake stood before a crowd of bikers gathered for the first Ride for Mercy, a charity ride born from pain and faith. "I was born deaf," he told them, voice steady. "But not just in my ears, in my heart. A man of God taught me to listen again." Silence followed, then thunderous applause. Engines roared, not in rebellion, but in unity. As the riders took off, down the desert highway, Jake smiled, hearing peace in the noise. That night, alone on the porch, he whispered, "Still listening, old man." And in the soft wind, he swore he heard Elijah's voice reply, "Good work, son." The desert night spread wide and peaceful, stars glowing like quiet witnesses. Jake locked the doors of the Open Ear and stood for a moment on the steps, listening. Inside, children's laughter and a soft hymn drifted through the cracked windows. The same song Elijah used to hum while fixing the roof. The sound wrapped around him like a warm blanket. He walked toward his motorcycle, running his hand along the cool metal. The bike gleamed under the moonlight. no longer a tool of fear, but a reminder of redemption. The air smelled faintly of dust and wild sage. From the kitchen came Mama Dee's familiar voice, scolding the teens for leaving crumbs, followed by their laughter. Every sound felt sacred now. Ordinary life turned holy. Jake sat on the railing, eyes on the glowing cross above the mission. It cast a golden halo across the sand, soft and steady. He thought of Elijah's wrinkled hand on his face, the fire that tested him, and the mercy that followed. Each memory beat in time with his heart. Looking up at the sky, he whispered, "You did it, old man. You taught me how to hear." The wind stirred gently through the trees, carrying a whisper. "You're listening now." Jake smiled, eyes wet. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'm listening." And for the first time, the silence around him sounded exactly like peace. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.